Okay, so this week's Torah portion is Vayikra and covers the offerings at the beginning of Leviticus. I recently did a commentary on the portion where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac as a burnt offering. So I talked about how the burnt offering was prophetic of Yeshua. There's a lot of similarity between the offerings, so that study is also good for seeing the prophetic nature of all of them. Now, most of that commentary was about Leviticus 1. Now that I actually have Leviticus 1 for my portion, I'm going to talk about the food laws. Makes perfect sense. So I want to start addressing the question of why. Why did God give us the food laws? Is it just for health reasons? Now, unfortunately, most Christians today don't pay attention to the Torah. Many are concerned rather with greater spiritual experiences. And that's good. But the two aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, Paul says they're intertwined. Romans 7:14, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. When I started living out the parts of Torah that I wasn't before, like the food laws and the biblical holy days, my faith skyrocketed. And when discussing the spirit of a law, there are many layers. I say the top layer is as a test, like God states in the Torah. He wants to see if we'll obey him. Then, to know more about God's character, we have to study the deeper levels. Today, I'll just be scratching the surface of this topic. To start, let's look quick at the different items that were offered in the different offerings. If we compare this to the chapters that talk about the food laws, Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, we see that all the animals listed here are clean animals. They're food. The animals that we eat and the animals that were sacrificed are clean. We see this stipulation after the flood in Genesis 8:20. Then Noah built an altar to Yahweh and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. This week's portion states that part of the peace offering was burned as food on the altar. Leviticus 3:11, and the priest shall burn them on the altar as food, an offering made by fire to Yahweh. Verse 16, and the priest shall burn them on the altar as food, an offering made by fire for sweet aroma. All the fat is Yahweh's. Now, just for clarification, not every animal that is clean to eat was instructed for offerings. For example, locusts are clean animals to eat, but aren't listed in any biblical offering I'm aware of. Also, it's okay to eat leaven, except during the week of unleavened bread. However, it's forbidden as a burnt offering in this week's portion. Leviticus 2:11, no grain offering which you bring to Yahweh shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven nor any honey in any offering to Yahweh made by fire. In summary, only clean animals were allowed in offerings and for food. Unclean animals were not allowed as food or as offerings. Now let's look at where they were offered. We just saw the altar mentioned. And here we see the door of the tabernacle of meeting also listed. And here we see that the altar was at the front of the tabernacle of meeting. And in fact, the following passage from this week's portion explicitly states in Leviticus 4:18, and he shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar which is before Yahweh, which is in the tabernacle of meeting. And he shall pour the remaining blood at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So all these offerings were made in front of the tabernacle of meeting. The Hebrew word translated as meeting is moed, the same Hebrew word for the holy days in Leviticus 23. Part of the offerings was about meeting with God. And we looked at how some of the peace offering was eaten as food. The animals we eat play a part in who we're spiritually fellowshipping with. We just don't see the spiritual elements. Let's look at when there were witnesses to a spiritual manifestation that had occurred during an offering, when the angel of Yahweh appeared to Samson's parents. Now, to set this up, there are several passages, including this one, that indicate the angel of Yahweh was Yahweh himself. Judges 13:15. Then Manoah said to the angel of Yahweh, please let us detain you, and we will prepare a young goat for you. It's a clean animal. And the angel of Yahweh said to Manoah, though you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you offer burnt offering, you must offer it to Yahweh. For Manoah did not know he was the angel of Yahweh. So Manoah thought he was speaking to just another man. When we fellowship with each other, we often do it by feasting together. When Yeshua was on earth in the flesh, he ate with his disciples. The angel of Yahweh here was not flesh, but spirit. So for him to fellowship with Manoah, Manoah had to make an offering. And it had to specifically be to Yahweh. This is an example of God talking in the third person. Verse 19. So Manoah took the young goat with the grain offering and offered it upon the rock to Yahweh. And he did a wondrous thing while Manoah and his wife looked on. It happened as the flame went up toward heaven from the altar, the angel of Yahweh ascended in the flame of the altar. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell on their faces to the ground. So they witnessed the angel actually entering the flame and ascending. God was present with them and took part in their offering. This was not just a practice done with Yahweh, but with other gods also. There are multiple times in the Tanakh that God's people were rebuked and punished for making offerings to other gods. In ancient Greece and Rome, animal sacrifice was performed as a ritual to communicate with the gods, heroes, and other divine beings. Such rituals were meant to ask the divine recipients for favors, protection, and help, or to appease them. Animal sacrifice, in which prayer was central, was also a way for human worshipers to know the will of the gods, and often concluded with the distribution and consumption of the meat. There's a lot of counterfeiting with other religions. I believe that in the same way we saw Yahweh take part in Manoah's offering, false gods did the same with offerings to them. And we see that eating from the offered meat was a common practice in the Torah and in other religions. In particular, the animal bones recovered from sanctuaries have yielded significant information about the handling of sacrificial animals, which ranged from dogs and horses to game, fish, and snakes. So we see unclean animals being sacrificed along with clean animals, assuming all the fish here, or at least some of them were clean. All the dogs, horses, and snakes aren't. Different gods had different animals offered to them. I believe this is why God instructed that we only eat clean animals, because of the spiritual connection to fellowshipping with him versus fellowshipping with false gods, and the spiritual connections of the animals with the gods. Now, here's an example of demons going into unclean animals in the Gospels. Matthew 8:28. When Jesus had come to the other side, to the country of the Gergesenes, there met him 2 demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. So the demons begged him, saying, if you cast us out, permit us to go away into the herd of swine. Notice the demons asked, they wanted to go into the swine. Verse 32, and he said to them, go. So when they had come out, they went into the herd of swine. And suddenly the whole herd of swine ran violently down the steep place into the sea and perished in the water. So Yeshua was perfectly fine with the demons going into the swine. Now, there weren't any demons in the swine at first. We can tell by the change of their behavior. So you don't worry about every unclean animal like your pet dog or a pet cat having demons. But these passages demonstrate spiritual connections involving animals. And we looked at how fellowship with God and the eating of the animals was part of the offerings. Eating unclean animals and food offered to idols would be fellowshipping with demons. Paul mentions this. 1 Corinthians 10:18. Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything? Or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. Paul equated sacrifices to fellowship. And we saw how eating the meat was part of some offerings. So if we eat unclean animals, we are taking part in fellowship with demons. That's why God commands us not to eat unclean animals, because he does not want us to fellowship with demons. 1 Corinthians 10:21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. We are not to mix the holy with the profane. Other gods didn't have a problem taking offerings of animals designated for Yahweh. But Yahweh does not want us to eat animals that aren't clean for offering to him. Daniel did a teaching on Peter's vision of the unclean animals a while back. I believe if the mainstream church realized the spiritual components of the food laws, they wouldn't jump to false conclusions about that part of Scripture. We all need to understand the spiritual aspects of all the Torah, seek them out, and apply them to our lives. Shabbat Shalom.